Welcome and thank you all for joining us. My name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. The 2019 elections were about 11 weeks ago. It feels like forever. But believe it or not, the 2020 election season is just about upon us. We have 4 presidential nominating contests in February among the Democrats that start with the Iowa caucuses in less than 2 weeks on February 3rd. We've been looking at this date as long off in the future for so long, it's hard to believe it's really right up there. And then 1 month later, on March 3rd, several states will hold primaries for the 2020 congressional elections, and we will be off and running on this election season. Here at Ballotpedia, our outstanding newsletter that covers the primaries, the heart of the primaries, just debuted for 2020 last week. And the second issues are coming out today. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail later on in the webinar, but this is definitely the resource you're going to want to have for the next 8 months as we break down all of these interesting intra-party races this season. So to whet your appetite for what will be a very, very busy election season, we wanted to take an early look at the 2020 congressional primaries and 2020 primaries in general. So to help me do that, joining me is Amé Latour. She is a staff writer on our marquee team here at Ballotpedia. She's going to be covering several House and Senate races throughout the year, and also writing the Congress section of that Heart of the Primaries newsletter. Amé, thanks for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks a lot, Dave. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Okay, it's awesome having you. So before we dive into the primaries, let's just take a more broad look at things. We've got 435 House seats up for election in 2020, all of them. And then we have 35 Senate seats, including 2 special elections. So right now in the Senate, Republicans have a 53 seat, control 53 seats. The Democrats have 45, and there are 2 independents, Angus King, and Bernie Sanders, who caucus with the Democrats. And then over in the House of Representatives, the Democrats have 232 seats for their majority. So given all of those elections going on, Amé, can you tell us how many of these races we'll be following closely at Ballotpedia?
Sure. So we call the races we're following closely battlegrounds. And some of these are the races we think will be competitive, but we look at more than competitiveness when we decide what's a battleground. So races might be interesting for other reasons. For example, a primary election that features a major policy conflict within a party, or an election with a significant amount of spending around it, or national political figures weighing in on it. And our list of battlegrounds is going to change throughout the year. But at the moment, for general elections, we have 17 Senate battlegrounds and 72 House battlegrounds. So that's about half of Senate elections and about 1 in 6 House races.
All right, so that's about 89 races. That's fantastic. What about on the primary side? How many battleground primaries do we anticipate covering?
So in the Senate, now we have 10 Democratic primary battlegrounds and 5 Republican battlegrounds. For the House, we have 32 Democratic and 40 Republican primary battlegrounds.
Wow, so that's also, that's quite a few as well. That's 72, that's like 87. That's a lot of races that we're intensely tracking. And we have some maps here showing where these battlegrounds are across the country. Some of these primaries are pretty well underway because of the timing of the election, I guess, and also just the nature of how campaigning works in that particular district. Some are still pretty far way off. As I said before, the first regularly scheduled congressional primaries are on March 3rd. That's in 5 states. And the last primary of the season is September 15th in Delaware. So, looking at that now, Amé, can you talk to us about some of the major issues that have been coming up in some of these primaries so far?
Sure. So on the Republican side, we're seeing some competition over who is the strongest Trump ally. One example of that is the Republican primary for Senate in Alabama. Candidates there have been emphasizing their support for the president, for his policy positions, and defending him against the impeachment effort as well. Trump won Alabama by 28 percentage points in 2016, and Democrat Doug Jones won a special election to the Senate seat in 2017 after Senator Jeff Sessions became Attorney General. And Sessions is running for that seat again. Some of the others in that race are football coach Tommy Tuberville, 2017 Senate candidate Roy Moore, and U.S. Representative Bradley Byrne.
And Alabama, interestingly, is one of those states that holds their primary on March 3rd. So this one will be decided in a matter of 6-7 weeks. I guess there could be a runoff in Alabama, but this is one of those that I imagine is going to be heating up pretty quickly.
Definitely, yes. So Maine's 2nd district is another place where most of the Republican primary candidates are competing over their Trump-supporting credentials, except for a county treasurer in the race. He says he's more neutral on Trump. The other candidates in that primary are a couple former state legislators and former Governor Paul LePage's spokesperson.
And that's a district with a Democratic incumbent that was won by Trump in 2016, right?
Yeah, it is. Trump won Maine's 2nd by 10 percentage points. Then in 2018, Democrat Jared Golden won the House race, beating the Republican incumbent. That was also the first congressional race decided by ranked choice voting. It was a close one.
Yeah, I remember that one. And also an interesting note since then is that Representative Golden split his vote on the impeachment articles. He voted in favor of one of the articles and he voted against the other. He's the only member of the House of Representatives who did that. Does Representative Golden have any primary challengers?
He doesn't currently, but the filing deadline in Maine isn't until March, so that could change.
Yes, that could be. It'll be interesting to see if his impeachment vote becomes a topic of conversation or becomes a point on the campaign trail if he does draw challengers. Are we seeing any other ways in which the impeachment conversation is affecting congressional primaries?
Well, one of the things I'll be interested to see is how it might play out in other districts with Democratic House incumbents that Donald Trump won in 2016. There are 31 of those districts, and that includes Maine's 2nd. If those incumbents draw primary challengers, I wonder how their votes will be highlighted in those races. So Democrats in 29 of those 31 districts voted for impeachment. Representatives Jeff Van Drew and Colin Peterson were the exceptions. And Van Drew switched parties last month, so he's going to be in the Republican primary, or he is currently rather. And Peterson, he hasn't said yet whether he's going to run for re-election.
Yeah, Peterson is in Minnesota, I believe. So impeachment has certainly been a major issue in the districts where representatives, have changed their party affiliation. You mentioned Jeff Van Drew in New Jersey 2nd. That's my home district. That's where I grew up. And he switched affiliations from Democrat to Republican after he voted against the articles of impeachment. And then we also have Justin Amash in Michigan's 3rd district, who changed from the Republican Party to an independent, and that was last year in 2019.
Right. Yeah, and there are 3 Republican primary candidates besides Van Drew in New Jersey's 2nd. Those candidates were in the race before Van Drew's party switch, and they've been critical of that switch, saying he's not a real Republican. Donald Trump endorsed Van Drew, and several local party leaders have done the same in the past few weeks. And that includes some who had endorsed businessman David Richter, another candidate in that race earlier on. And in the Democratic primary for the 2nd district, 7 people are running so far.
Yeah, I can tell you from growing up in that district, that's a lot of activity in New Jersey's second. We used to go through a period where we would have the same congressman for years and years. So for all of this to be happening is I'm sure really interesting. What's happening over in Amash's district, over in Michigan's third?
So Mash has said he's going to run for re-election. The major party filing deadline is in April, and so far there are 7 Republican primary candidates and 3 Democratic primary candidates in that district. It'll be interesting to see how and to what extent the candidates on both sides discuss their positions on impeachment. Amash, who's now an independent, as you said, he voted for impeachment.
And what will also be very interesting is to see what happens if there's a three-way race in the general election. So Amash was first elected, I think, in 2010. He's been reelected several times. And so then the question is, will voters stick with him as an independent? How many voters would do that? How many will just, will vote for whoever the Republican nominee? And if there is a three-way race and it splits the votes, which way is that going to go? It's going to be very fascinating.
Yes, yeah, there are so many questions in Michigan's third, and I'm looking forward to keeping an eye on all that.
Yeah, definitely. So now let's talk about, we've talked about impeachment a little bit. Now let's talk about the Democratic presidential primary and how it relates to the congressional primaries. So one of the things that is a pretty common theme being discussed in the presidential race is the battle between either the moderate or progressive course for the party. That was a conversation in 2016. We saw it in the 2018 congressional elections in certain places. So with another presidential election happening this year, I can imagine we're going to see that debate be amplified even more. So where are some races where you're seeing this type of conversation happening so far?
Yeah, so I think one of the clearest examples of where I've seen the electability debate being reflected is the Democratic primary for Senate in Kentucky. That electability debate is part of the moderate versus progressive debate. It's the question of who can win and who can beat Republicans. And that Senate seat in Kentucky is held by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And there are 10 Democratic candidates in the Senate primary. Most of the media attention is going to Amy Mcgrath and Charles Booker. So Mcgrath lost a House race in Kentucky in 2018 by 3 percentage points, and Charles Booker was elected to the Kentucky State House in 2018. And in that race, Mcgrath has called herself a moderate. She's been critical of Medicare for All, and she said she wants to work with the president on things like lowering drug costs and draining the swamp. And Charles Booker, supports Medicare for All and a Green New Deal. And he recently argued that what he called running to the soft center isn't going to beat Mitch McConnell. So Booker's talking about building a movement and winning through turnout generated by that movement. And that's very much like Bernie Sanders has been arguing in the presidential primary.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like a clear example of that type of conversation. Now, obviously, with that, you have the counter narrative that basically says in some districts, if it's a red or a purple state or a purple district, that a progressive doesn't have as good a chance to win, and that the more moderate candidate stands the better chance of winning in the general election in November against the Republican.
Yes, that's right. That is the counter narrative. And Kentucky is one of the states that holds congressional and presidential primaries on the same day. So it'll be really interesting to see if both the Senate and presidential primaries go the same direction there. In 2016, Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders in the Kentucky primary by 0.5 percentage point.
And what's interesting is that those progressive versus moderate conversations, those tensions within the Democratic Party, also spill over and affect the Republican primary in certain areas, in the sense that some Republican candidates associate the Democratic candidates with the most or the more progressive proposals out there, and then that enables the Republican candidate to say that they are the best candidate to beat socialism or whatever.
Yes, yeah, that's certainly happening in Kentucky and elsewhere. McConnell put out an ad showing a picture of Mcgrath in the same frame as pictures of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And in Alabama, Jeff Sessions recently released an ad describing himself as the man the Democrats fear. And in that ad, he describes Democrats as socialists and radicals.
Yeah, that's something we also saw last year in the special election, I think in North Carolina 9, between Dan Bishop and Dan McCready. So it's always fascinating the way candidates look to try to portray themselves versus portraying members of the other party. It's all a very fascinating dynamic. All right, so thanks for that overview of some of these broader themes that we're seeing already, even in January in some of these primaries so far, May. You've also touched on, throughout this, you've given a lot of examples of some interesting races, but are there any others that really stand out for you that you'd like to highlight?
Sure. So one that I think definitely deserves mentioning is the Democratic primary for Senate in Massachusetts. That's where Representative Joe Kennedy is challenging incumbent Ed Markey. And there was a write-up in Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball recently calling that race the most unusual Senate primary in decades. The writer of the piece said Markey doesn't have any of the vulnerabilities that are kind of typical of the few senators who've lost primaries in the past 30 years. But the writer also said that Kennedy still has a decent chance in this race. And this primary isn't a clear-cut case of a progressive challenge to a more moderate incumbent. Ed Markey backed the Green New Deal. He's got endorsements from Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And Joe Kennedy, he was recently endorsed by some representatives, including John Lewis and Mark Pocan. Pocan's the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus.
Yeah, that really is going to be a fascinating Senate race. You also have the dynamic of the Kennedy name in Massachusetts. But it isn't a clear-cut ideological divide as you discussed. So that one, I think we'll be following that one for a long time, because Massachusetts doesn't have their primary until in the fall. So that one's I'm sure going to be one that we'll be paying really close attention to for a long time. Now let's transition a little bit from some individual races to some of the major players in some of these races from an organizational standpoint. There's been a lot of debate around the national party committees endorsing candidates in primaries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So there are 4 political committees that are associated with the 2 major parties that are focused on Senate and House elections. On the Democratic side, there's the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And these groups have policies of only endorsing incumbent Democrats if they're running for re-election. The groups also endorse in races without Democratic incumbents.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of debate about that. So the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee has endorsed in some battleground Senate races without Democratic incumbents. So John Hickenlooper in Colorado, Cal Cunningham in North Carolina, among others. But there's been some backlash from some of the other primary candidates, as you would expect. What are some of the groups that support challengers to incumbents or support progressive candidates in these open seat primaries?
Well, there's Justice Democrats, which was very active in 2018. There's also the Sunrise Movement, which supports the Green New Deal. And a newer committee is the Courage to Change Political Action Committee, which Ocasio-Cortez launched. And she's been critical of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee because of a policy they have where they don't give business to consultants who work with primary challengers to Democratic incumbents. So the Courage to Change PAC is said it's going to support candidates it considers progressive, and that includes challengers to incumbents.
And of course, the background of that is that Ocasio-Cortez herself was a challenger to an incumbent in 2018. She beat Joe Crowley, who was a member of the Democratic House leadership in the primary in New York's 14th. So we've looked a little bit at the Democrats. How about on the Republican side? What are the Republican Party committee policies on endorsements in primaries?
Well, the National Republican Senatorial Committee only endorses in races with Republican incumbents, and they back the incumbent in those races. They stay out of the open primaries. And the National Republican Congressional Committee says it has a policy of not publicly endorsing candidates in primaries.
That's very interesting. The two parties then clearly have a different approach with regard to their party committees and how they approach endorsements. So are there any other groups that we should be talking about that are endorsing or spending that you've been keeping your eye on?
Well, I'll be interested to see what Americans for Prosperity does this year. That group was founded by David Koch, and the group's super PAC, AFP Action, recently said it'll be getting involved in more races than ever before. And the group has had some tensions with the Trump administration. They've agreed on some things like the First Step Act and Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but there's been some disagreement on some trade and immigration policies. And AFP Action said it'll back candidates of any party that align with its policy positions.
And speaking of another group, I saw that the Republican Main Street Partnership PAC endorsed Randy Feenstra earlier this week, and he's challenging Representative Steve King in Iowa, in Iowa's 4th, I think.
Yep, yeah, that's right. So the Republican Main Street Partnership, its website says its members represent the governing wing of the Republican Party, and that it supports policies that can get bipartisan support. And its PAC says it's especially targeting suburban districts this year. A lot of the districts that Democrats picked up in 2018 were in suburbs. So we'll definitely be paying attention to their primary endorsements as well.
All right, Ame, thank you so much for the rundown of these various groups that have been getting involved in primaries. And obviously before we talked about some individual races, some broad themes. Let's just take a few minutes to talk about how folks can stay on top of these, all of these things as we go through the season. And that is getting back to the newsletter that we put out that I think is just fantastic. It's called The Heart of the Primaries. It was first launched in 2018. The first issues for the news cycle have been out in the last week. And I know, Ame, you write the Congress section of that newsletter. So tell us what a reader can expect to see in Heart of the Primaries.
Sure. So 2 editions of the newsletter go out each Wednesday. There's a Democratic edition and a Republican edition, and people can subscribe to one or both of those. Each edition has stories on congressional, state executive, and state legislative elections. Those stories are connected to a recent news event, which could be a significant endorsement, policy debates within each party, retiring incumbents, polling, and so on. We also have a nice feature called Power Players, where we highlight an influencer in each edition.
Yeah, I saw that in the first issues from last week, we looked at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee and the National Republican Senatorial Committee that you talked about earlier.
Right, and today's issues, those look at both parties' congressional committees. We've also had a story about the Democratic primary for Senate in Massachusetts and one on New Jersey's 2nd District Republican primary, both of which we talked about a bit earlier. We've had stories about gubernatorial and state legislative primaries across a bunch of different states as well.
And people can go and sign up to get one or both editions emailed to them each Wednesday by going to ballotpedia.org/the heart of the primaries. Before we go, can you just kind of give us a brief overview of what's happening at the state level, state executive and state legislative elections happening this year?
Oh, sure. So state executive elections this year include 11 races for governor, 10 attorney general races, and 7 for secretary of state. That's a lot less than in 2018 when we had 36 elections for governor compared to just 11 this year. And across the country, 86 of the 99 state legislative chambers are holding elections this year for a total of almost 6,000 seats. And as filing deadlines pass, we'll be updating our site and Heart of the Primaries with the number of candidates running and how many of those races have incumbents running as well.
All right, thank you very much, Ame, for talking with me about the congressional primaries, those major players, organizations, and the Heart of the Primaries newsletter.
Oh, thanks a lot, Dave, and thanks for joining us, everyone.
All right, this was a great briefing that talked about a lot of really neat stuff, and I hope you enjoyed it. This was a look at the key congressional primaries, the campaign themes, the organizations, all of those that will influence the primaries in the months ahead. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this briefing, and we just kind of talked about, there are 5 states that will hold their first congressional primaries of 2020 on March the 3rd, and that's going to continue an election season that goes all the way through to September 15th. In some states, recognize that the date of the presidential primary is different from their congressional and state primaries. So there's going to be a lot happening, and you're going to hear a lot of talk about whether presidential primaries, state primaries, and whatnot. To keep all of this sorted out, you can go to our website and check out the schedule, and we'll have coverage of all of these key primaries at ballotpedia.org. So speaking of the presidential race, as I mentioned in the beginning, those nominating contests begin in less than 2 weeks. After the Iowa caucuses, you're going to have the New Hampshire primaries. There's a Democratic presidential debate on February 7th. And then still in February, there are 2 more debates, 2 more early state presidential primaries. There's going to be a lot happening. So the best way to stay in the know on the presidential race is to subscribe to one of our 2 newsletters on that. That would be the daily presidential news briefing or the weekly presidential news briefing, and you can sign up for both of those if you can. You go to our website at ballotpedia.org. And finally, we encourage you to visit ballotpedia.org for all of the political news that's happening, including Supreme Court and everything else that's happening. And there you can see our full offering of newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our summary of the week's political news in the tab. So, had a great briefing today. Thank you for watching, everyone.